Welcome to Chapter 6, Same Lake, Different Boat, coming alongside people touched by disability. The title of Chapter 6 is on coming to terms with a new reality. In this chapter, Steph explores the essential question, what does a family face with the onset of disability?
I remember when Michael was born, we weren't prepared for his problems, and immediately he had what they called a cluster of midline deformities. So it was, for us, we couldn't be in denial. We didn't go through a denial phase. It was obvious that life would never be the same. And I remember laying in my hospital bed and realizing that God had asked more of me than I could possibly give. And at first I felt overwhelmed and maybe even a little bit angry because I felt like he had asked too much of me and of my family.
Jennifer, my wife, had a normal pregnancy, had no clue of anything wrong until Benjamin was born, and immediately everything seemed fine. But soon after, they realized something was wrong, and so they put him in the hospital for a week to go through the gamut of tests, and an MRI finally revealed that he was born with, and he received his first diagnosis, which is agenesis of the corpus callosum, which basically means part of his brain was not there. He was born without it completely. That's when I realized this is serious and life transforming. And my first reaction was to be on the floor, face down, just confessing to God, I can't handle this. There's no way. We can't handle this.
On the way to church, we had what people call an accident. We don't see it as an accident.
We were actually in church in Mobile, and I looked down and I had a couple of voicemails, and she said, Susan, there's been a wreck, and Mom's not breathing. We didn't know at the time anything about paralysis or anything. At the time, they were just trying to save her life, and they really didn't expect her to live.
All right, so the essential question I want to ask tonight is, what does a family face with the onset of disability? What does a family face with the onset of disability? And as a second question that follows right behind that, how can the church identify and respond to what the family needs? So what's the family face with the onset of disability, and how can the church identify and respond to what the family needs? I think when you look at the onset of disability in the life of a family, what we want is basically a picture of something that's fairly straightforward, right? And if you look at the picture on the slide, you'll see that what we have a tendency to want, even if it's not linear, we want it to be directional, right? We want the path that a person goes through as they deal with the onset of disability to be something that we can track with easily. And yet the process that families and individuals go through as they process the entrance of disability in their lives is much more complicated than that. It looks more like a highway system out in Los Angeles, right? Where there's a huge intersection of all these ramps and pathways that intersect. And so even though in these next 4 chapters we'll talk through what does the onset of disability look like in the life of a family, what does the whole issue of acceptance look like, what does a new normal or a steady state or a family finding their stride, what does that look like, and then what's the great opportunity that God provides. Those are not step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, right? That's what we all want, a nice clean package there. There's a whole lot of interaction and a whole lot of dynamic, what's the word I want? There's a feedback mechanism, that goes on. So you may struggle with onset, and you may work through issues of acceptance and enter some area of new normalcy, and then a new element of grief enters in, and you're dealing with a grief issue again and issues of acceptance, right? So throughout even the life of a family affected by disability, there can be a revisiting of these different areas. And so while what we'd like is something linear, that's not the way it works. So I just want to make sure that you understand that while I'm presenting 4 phases, they're not 4 sequential steps, okay? So this quote on this next slide really is just what I think really characterizes the whole idea behind this area of coming to terms with a new reality. St. Gregory of Nyssa said, mercy is a voluntary sorrow which enjoins itself to the suffering of another. Mercy is a voluntary sorrow which enjoins itself to the suffering of another. And so what I try to do is to capture that at the end when we're done with this, with how that actually applies to that quote. what a difference a day makes. Right, you can think about positive experiences in your life and what a difference a day makes. Your high school graduation, right? One day you were in high school and slugging it out, and the next day you're free, right? And what a difference a day makes. When you get married someday, what a difference a day makes. You're single up to that point, then you have your beloved life partner alongside of you, right? And so there are lots of things in life that are sort of watershed events in our lives, and some of them are positive and some of them are difficult. And what I'd like to say in advance is I think disability it can be both, because we talked about that in the earlier sections, that there are difficulties that come with disability, and there are tremendous blessings in the way that God brings his redemptive power to bear in the life of individuals and families touched by disability in really unique and really powerful ways that really illuminate the gospel in our lives. So I don't want to couch disability as an exclusively negative event. On its onset, though, the focus tends to be on the difficulty, and for a lot of reasons. A lot of reasons because of the crisis-oriented nature of the onset of disability, because of the unexpected nature of it. So what I want to try to give you is a word picture of what that onset feels like. And I want you to remember, when we get to the fourth segment in this center section of the book, we're going to talk about the great opportunity. So don't lose the perspective that there are both elements here. So let's talk about the onset in terms of what a difference a day makes. We have all different ages in the room here, but September 11th. What were you doing on September 11th? Everybody can say, I know exactly what I was doing on September 11th. And I was over at my friend Douglas Coyner's house. One of my best friends, Patty, has a son who has some developmental disabilities that are primarily, exclusively physical. And Doug had just had a serious neck surgery done at Children's Hospital and had just come home the night before with a Halo, one of those head devices all screwed in. And Patty had a lot of long days at the hospital with Doug, so I'd offered to come over in the morning and hang out with Douglas, because he was still really needed someone with him when he was starting to move around, and so that Patty could sleep. So I came over to the house about 8:45 on September 11th. And I sat down with Doug, and Doug was sitting down watching TV, and he's using the remote, and I'm talking to Doug, and I'm not a TV person, so I'm really not paying any attention to what's on TV, and Doug's using the remote, and he's flipping through, and as we're talking, he's getting increasingly frustrated. So he said, it's the same thing on every channel. So I looked up, and I saw that the World Trade Center building was on fire, and so I said, Doug, this looks important, we better listen to this. So we turned the one station on, and we started watching, and even as we just started to watch and try to process what they were, all the announcers were trying to figure out what was going on. And even as they were talking, you saw live the next plane come into the South Tower. And that stunning feeling when the second plane hit that this wasn't an accident, right? And everybody's thinking at first that there was some kind of an accident, and when the second plane hit, you realize it's not an accident, right? And then all these horrible things start happening. You see people start jumping out of the windows and to escape the fire, and it just started unfolding from the hit of the North Tower to the South Tower to the Pentagon, and then the South Tower collapsed, which was absolutely devastating. I mean, the thought never crossed my mind that the thing was going to come down. And then you start thinking how many people were in there, and even as that was happening, then the plane hit in Pennsylvania, and we're from Pennsylvania, right? So all of a sudden it's hitting very close to home, and then the North Tower came down, and as all this is unfolding, with me and with this 13-year-old Douglas sitting next to me. And Doug looks at me and he says, when will it stop? And then he said, well, are we safe? And I didn't know the answer to either one of those questions. But when you think about the onset of disability in the life of a family, the closest thing I can explain to what it feels like is a September 11th. This is entirely unexpected, totally life-changing experience, because one of the things that happened at September 11th is we all recognized immediately that somehow life was, from here on out, was going to be different. That this was going to change everything, and no one could tell you how it was going to change everything other than, and I think universally we understood that life was never going to be exactly the same after this day. So we had this huge experience with grief, right? This terrible grief experience of watching all of these people die and suffer, this experience of just this raw, in the case of the attacks on the World Trade Center, this raw evil, right? This raw hatred. So it's these effects of the fall entirely unveiled, right? There's just this, and that was one of the things I remember completely stunning me by that experience, was just the white hot hatred that drove these acts was just a stunning kind of thing as well. And so, but this whole feeling that you're in shock, you can't fathom what's going on, you're trying to figure it out, that life will never be the same, and just the raw, searing pain that went with that whole experience. That's the best word picture I can give you to what the onset of disability feels like. Now, I'm not saying that hatred has anything to do with disability, but I'm just saying but what does have to do with disability is just that level of an experience with difficulty and brokenness that's right there, in front of you in a very painful kind of way. So there are three major feelings, I think, that families tend to grapple with right from the outset when they're first trying to get their hands around this, is these feelings of grief, anger, and fear. Grief really is a normal response to a loss, to a sense of loss. So anytime you experience a loss in life, you generally have some type of a grief response. And disability is a loss in the sense that there can be a variety of different ways that you experience loss because of disability. One can be, for parents, for example, maybe have a newborn that's born with developmental disabilities. It's a loss of expectations, right? It can be a loss of expectations of what you thought your life for your child was going to be like. All through the pregnancy, you have this perception in your mind of how you picture your child's going to be, or what their life's going to be like, or what they're going to do. And all of a sudden, if your child's born with profound disabilities, that's a life-altering type of experience where that often brings a grief reaction with it. It can be if you're the person that acquires the disability, maybe you have an amputation, or you have a car accident that causes you to become a quadriplegic. There's a loss of capacity, right? And so there's a grief with the loss of the capacities that you might have had before in life. For somebody who has dementia, there's a loss of personality, right? So maybe your life partner is diagnosed with Alzheimer's or with Pick's disease, and now all of a sudden you start to lose, right? You start to lose that person in terms of their personality that you've lived with for so many years. And with that often goes the hopes and dreams that you had. Say that you're 60 years old and your spouse gets dementia, all of a sudden your hopes and dreams for what your retirement is going to look like are going to be really altered. And if you have a child that's born with developmental disabilities, that will really alter the hopes and dreams that you had right now. That doesn't mean you won't ever have other hopes and dreams, but there's a real loss of the ones that you've carried to this point. Along with that comes an experience with anger. Usually as part of a grief response, anger is one of the phases that people go through as they go through a grief response. And as Christians, we become very uncomfortable with the idea of anger, and yet it's a very normal part of struggling with loss. And it's something that you just really can't avoid when you're dealing with difficult, life-changing type of experiences. And so one of the reasons I think we also experience anger is a sense of loss of control. We have a perception that we carry that we have a lot more influence and control over life events than we really do. When we can say in our theology that we believe God's in control, but in our practice, a lot of times that's not how we really operate. And so you should expect to encounter anger and grief when you deal with families who are dealing with the onset of disability. And the third one is fear. Fear of the unknown produces a lot of anxiety. Matter of fact, I've heard people describe the difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is the encounter of a real threat in the present, and anxiety is a fear of what will happen in the future. And the kind of questions that a family's faced with, and the volume of questions that they're faced with, cover things from how do I cope with this? Where will we get the money? Right, to deal with whatever the disability is. How will other people treat my family member? And that ties into that whole thing we talked about several weeks ago about the whole concept of disability having a functional and a social dimension, right? And so how will other people from that social perspective treat the one that I care about, and how's that going to affect me and my family? Another thing is, who will help me in terms of daily assistance, and who will care for my child when I'm not here anymore, right? When you have a quote unquote typical child that's born, you expect that what they'll do is grow up and follow a certain sequence of events and become independent. But if you have a child that's born that you know is going to have some level of dependency on you their whole life, right away you start reaching, into the future with questions that raise a lot of anxiety. So grief, anger, and fear are the three primary feelings. And remember, if you're trying to get your hands on what that feels like, think about September 11th, right? Those are three very common feelings that most people felt on that day. A huge experience of grief, a lot of anger, and a lot of fear, okay? So what specifically is the family dealing with in terms of the onset of disability? We'll talk about a list of different things here in terms of the type of issues that they face. The first one involves family adjustments. Every family goes through adjustments when a new baby's born, right? So if you have a new child that's born into the family, whether it's number 1, number 2, number 3, or number 10, right? There's always a change in the family system that takes place to adapt to this new person coming into the life of that family. But when a child is born into a family that has a disability, the adjustments that take place are much more pronounced. And so one of the things to remember when it comes to family adjustments is that disability is a family affair. It isn't something that just happens to a person, but it affects their entire family, and it affects their church family as well. So when you think about disability coming into the life of a family, to remember that the changes that would happen, there's a typical level of changes that would happen with a new family member anyway, but with a child with a disability, those are much more pronounced. So for example, in the pictures on this slide that I had when Tim was born, our son Freddie was not quite 2, and Freddie's life had been pretty much a pretty predictable, nice little toddler routine, until Tim was born, and that would have changed with the new baby in the house anyway. But Tim had so many medical issues associated with having Downs that Tim was in and out of the hospital frequently for the first 7 months, and so Freddie went from having sort of a very orderly kind of routine at home to having his life completely turned upside down. And we don't have family in the area, so he was in and out of different folks' homes from church, on different days of the week. And when there were really serious hospitalizations, my in-laws would come and take Freddie for a period of time, so he would be at their house for maybe 2 weeks at a time. So that may not seem like a really long time to an adult, but to a 2-year-old, 2 weeks away from your mom and dad is a really big deal. And to do that over and over again in the course of a few months is a really, really disruptive kind of thing. And I'm not in any way negating the blessing of having people that could help us. I'm very thankful that in terms of those fearful questions, who will help us with this care, we had really loving family and family members in the body of Christ that really stepped alongside of us and helped us. But from the perspective of a 2-year-old, it's a very life-changing kind of experience. That's just from the perspective of a 2-year-old, right? There are lots of different ways that disability changes the life of a family besides a newborn. So what happens if it's the wage earner that becomes disabled, right? That's a totally different set of circumstances that require a totally different kind of set of family adjustments. What about if it's a sibling, right? What if it's a spouse, right? So each one of depending on the role in the family, will really affect what type of family adjustments have to take place. But in every case, there are family adjustments that occur. And here's the thing, that as all this change is taking place, and the grief and the anger and the fears being processed, the rest of life keeps moving. You don't get to push the pause button, right? And so the laundry continues to pile up, the bills still have to be paid, child care still has to happen, somebody still has to go to work, right? And so that's what adds to the complexity as well. Nobody gets the privilege when they're going through a period of crisis to just set the rest of life on hold. So this family adjustments are a significant thing. Another one is medical issues. Virtually every disabling condition has some type of medical involvement. I mean, it's the medical community that defines what a disability is, so there's going to be medical involvement that way. And that can range from everything from frequent doctor appointments to a huge variety of specialists. There are parents that have 6, 8, 10 specialists that they have to take their kids to see or their family member to see, or it can be life-threatening conditions, can be very very serious health conditions that come with the disabling condition. And so for Tim had a really serious heart condition that is fairly common for children with Down syndrome, but also he had sort of the worst case scenario of that particular type of heart condition. And so he seemed to capture, well, kids with Downs also have very lowered immunity in their infancy as well. And so he caught, it seemed like everything that came down the pike. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but he was in the hospital 7 times in the first 7 months, and he had RSV pneumonia, and he had congestive heart failure. He had bacterial spinal meningitis and almost died from that. He was in the hospital for croup. He was in the hospital for heart catheterization. He was in the hospital for open heart surgery, and that was all in the first 7 months. And that's not nearly as complicated as it gets for some families. So. So you can see that the medical issues can be really challenging. What also comes with that package, and that almost all of us are unprepared for, the bioethical issues that can arise as a result of that. When I think about it now, I think it's kind of interesting that the fact that all of us will face death at some point, right? All of us will face our own death and the death of our family members, and yet as Christians, we're generally woefully ill-equipped to answer questions about life and death matters and about the use of technology or the lack thereof in different situations. And there's a book I would recommend to you. It's called Bioethics, a Primer for Christians. And it's an excellent short book. And what I love about it, it's not a rules-based approach to bioethics, but a biblical principles-based approach. And let me give you one quote out of that, because here's an example of the types of, it doesn't give you a specific example, but it helps you see the range of where a family's thought sometimes has to go, even as they're trying to process these other things and deal with these other practical issues of life. This is from Bioethics, a Primer for Christians. It says, on the one hand, we ought not choose death or aim at death, but on the other hand, neither should we act as if continued life were the only or even the highest good. It is not a God, but a gift of God. Thus we should neither aim at death nor continue the struggle against it when its time has come. Allowing to die is permitted, killing is not. Within these limits lies the sphere of our freedom. How many of us could answer the question of within those limits lies the sphere of our freedom? What would you do in fill in the blank, right? And Meilander, who wrote this book, goes on to give us some really helpful principles to do that. But as Christians, we generally don't talk about these things. So families will find themselves in the ER, right, or in the intensive care unit with a family member under these kind of circumstances, right? Happens overnight. And all of a sudden, they have to be making really difficult decisions. So medical issues are another area. Financial issues. As soon as you're into medicine, you're into money, right? And so financial issues almost always come with disability, not just because of medical bills for insurance, but also things like in-home nursing care. If you're in a wheelchair and you need a handicap accessible van with a lift. If you need modifications to your existing home, because you can't get a wheelchair through the front door, right? Or the bathroom's inaccessible. You might need wider door frames or bars for the shower. Or for some families, it's more cost-effective to buy a new home, so that involves moving, right? Instead, in the middle of all these types of things. And then there are a lot of non-medical costs of hospitalization. If every time a family is overnight at the hospital for days or weeks on end with a child, you have to eat, and that's not covered under insurance. You have to sleep somewhere, which often is in the room, right? Or you have to drive back and forth from home, right? And so there are just a lot of non-medical cost of hospitalization. And I told a little story in the book about a time that we were very blessed to have some people that gave us funds to help with those non-medical costs. A family from church that just sent us a big check in the mail because they knew what was involved in that. So it was incredibly helpful. But I was in the hospital with Tim. He went in for a cardiology checkup and ended up coming down with bacterial spinal meningitis while he was there. That's what saved his life, and was that he came down with it at the hospital. And so anyway, he was so ill. I was there for 7 days without leaving the building at all. And finally he stabilized after about a week, and a good friend of mine really encouraged me it was time to go home and sleep. So I thought I would go ahead and go home and spend the night at home. And as I was driving out of the parking lot, I realized I had never had my ticket stamped when I first went in because, this is not a high priority. And so as I'm going out, I hand the lady the ticket in the booth, and she goes, "That'll be $37." Now, this was before, it was a frequent use of MAC cards and Visa, right? And so I didn't have $37 in cash with me. And I looked at her and said, "I have $37. And she was very rules oriented. She was like, "Well, you have to, you have to have $37. So I looked behind her head and I saw that there was this sign that said "Lost ticket, $5. So I said, "Can I see that ticket, please?" And she gave me the ticket, and I threw it over the back seat of the car. I said, "I lost my ticket." So I said, "I have $5. Will you let me go?" So anyway, she didn't think too kindly of that, but it would, So anyway, God provides in mysterious ways. But anyway, financial issues can really, it's $37 is funny in that story, but $37,000, $370,000, that's not at all funny. And you'll often see, you go to the grocery store and you see those posters where if somebody's having a fundraiser, right, to cover the medical costs of a family. So financial issues are significant. Concerns for the future, we talked about that a little bit before, so I won't dwell on that too much. But the whole tendency with the concerns for the future is that there's this, it's kind of like a yo-yo. The tendency for a family is going to be to extrapolate into the future and try to figure out, right? Oh, what's it going to be like? I didn't expect to have a child with intellectual disability that would be with me the rest of my life. How's that going to affect retirement? Or what's it going to be like for my siblings? Or is this the best place for us to live anymore? Right? Or will my job cover these expenses? And so a family will have a tendency to extrapolate into the future and try to figure out what that looks like, and then realize, of course, that they can't. And so that's like the yo-yo snaps back. And almost all my friends, I could guarantee that have had children with disabilities have gone through the exact same thing. This yo-yo flies out and then it snaps back. And and really Jesus, when he, in Matthew 6:34, when he said, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for each day has enough trouble of its own." That really was the only thing I could come to in the end of, you can look at there are going to be future issues, and do not worry about tomorrow, for each day has enough trouble of its own. But it's the human tendency is very much to worry and to extrapolate into the future, and then to realize that the future is in God's hands alone. And of course, it's easy to stand back from that now that my son is 18, and say, well, of course, none of us know what's going to happen in the future in any of our lives, but that with all that you're processing with the onset of disability in the family, there's a big tendency towards that. One of the things that comes up with that is legal issues, and that may sound like, well, why would legal issues come up so early on? And yet they do, because they have a tendency that the way your assets are structured and the way your will is done can all affect funding that's available for the care of a family member who is disabled. And so even as a family is processing all these emotional things and all the realities of the medical issues and the family issues, the legal issues are right there. So you can imagine that's about the last thing that you have either the faculties or the emotional capacity to really address. And so it's just important to recognize that, and if you have good Christian lawyers in your congregation who can help people out at times like that, that's just an important thing to realize, that those kind of things will come up as well. Another one is social issues. What happens with the onset of disability into not just the life of the family, but the church family, or even the folks who might be around a family in their neighborhood, is that all of a sudden those prejudices that we each carry kind of rise to the surface. And so whether it's prejudice towards a person with a disability that somebody carries, and then we realize that they carry it until all of a sudden they're face to face, right, with somebody with a disabling condition, there just can create tensions in relationships that didn't exist before. So sometimes it can make situations that normally would have been a comfortable type of situation a stressful situation now because of your family member who has a disability. And I think I mentioned in one of the earlier talks a little bit about some of my encounters in the grocery store, right, with ladies who would come up and make comments about Tim and then withdraw or have pitting type of size and all. And one of the things I had to kind of come to terms with when I would go out as I braced myself for the next round was and this was part of my own maturing, was kind of coming to terms with when do I engage, right, on that, and when do I just ignore, right? And so there were times that if I was up to it, I could do a little education, right? There were other times I had to give myself permission to just keep going, And so, and even and of course, at the same time, I'm processing my own biases that I am very acutely becoming aware that I carry, right? And so I'm hardly in a position really to be addressing somebody else's because I can't even explain mine entirely to myself. And one of the other major things, one of the last things I'll cover tonight in terms of the onset of disability is the testing of their faith. For a family that is dealing with the entrance of disability in their lives, it's a faith testing experience for many people. It really causes people to ask questions like, "Where is God?" Right? And does He care? Did He cause it? Right? Will He help me? Those are real questions that become a real faith testing inquiries in the life of people. Can I trust Him? Can I trust God to really be with me through this? Remember, it's not like cancer. You can't get to the other side of it, right? And so, on the one hand, then it exposes weaknesses in our faith. Like, for example, I think one of the myths that I kind of carried around in my head, a faith myth, was, and I would never have said this until I kind of saw it, is if I'm good, bad things will not happen to me. Like, how much is wrong with that statement? There's so much wrong with that statement, right? But that really was one of the things I realized as I was processing all these different things and saying, that's what I fundamentally believe. If I'm good, right, which means I don't understand the gospel if I think I'm good, right, then bad things will not happen to me, and disability is in the category of bad things, right? So you see, there are two really bad biases, right, in there already where my thinking and my faith was open to correction. Now the good thing is that God used this experience in my life to actually teach me more about the gospel, and more about how to look accurately at disability and at myself as a result. So in the end, that became a really beneficial thing. It was a really hard thing, though, when it was happening. And the other thing, another thing I had to come face to face with was my own value system. I would easily have told you, and I would have been telling the truth, that I really valued the image of God in every person. I believed in that. But then all of a sudden I had a child with an intellectual disability, and my background was in academia, right? So I realized that one of my idols was the mind, right? And so here I had a child with limited intellectual, we all have limited, right? But more limited intellectual capacity than I was counting on, right? And so, I really had to wrestle with that, because I realized, what does that say about him when I put this value on academia? What does it say about Tim then? And what does it say about me that's how I'm looking at people? And so it was a really soul-searching experience for me that way, to say, well, here's a doctrine I say I believe in, right? And yet I obviously don't really understand it at all. And so, there are myth-buster kind of things and personal sin and idolatry kind of issues that get dealt with in the process of that. And the positive thing is, too, that there are things that we do kind of get on some level, and God strengthens them. So I think one of the areas where I had a good handhold that God really used to help me through that time was the sovereignty of God. And that being really a strong belief in the sovereignty of God helped me to get through that early time period, that first year, especially in Tim's life, and to be able to say, with certainty that I knew that God wasn't asleep at the switch, right? And that He had my good and His glory in mind, and that He would work this out towards that end. And so being able to hold on to that, even though I had no idea what that would look like, right? Was really a tremendous blessing. And some of the old hymns especially helped me a lot during that time. I had this one, the one hymn, "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I had all 4 stanzas of that memorized, sang it constantly. I remember Freddie coming up to me when he was like just 2 going, Mommy, why do you sing that song all the time? And it was because of words like this: when darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. Right? His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. And it did feel like a whelming flood sometimes. When all round my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. And those were the things that I held on to. And I remember going to the Thanksgiving service at church when Tim was about 10 months old, and being able to say, just that I knew that all I could say, while everything else felt like it had kind of fallen away, the one thing I could hold on to, this was still the only thing I could really say at that point, was that God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he'll do. And you know, that was as complex as my faith was at that point. But God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he'll do. And that was enough, you know. And so how can the church respond? How can the church help when a family is dealing with all these different things? Basically, three different things. And remember, we started at the beginning talking about mercy, right? Mercy is a voluntary sorrow which enjoins itself to the suffering of another. A voluntary sorrow that enjoins itself to the suffering of another. So it's voluntary, right? Mercy is voluntary, it's engaged, and it's personal. And so when you think about how can the church respond, think about that grid a little bit, because basically what the family needs are these 3 things: privacy, presence, and normalcy. Okay, they need privacy. It may sound like privacy and presence. How can those 2 coexist? And yet, you think about all these things that families processing. It takes some privacy to be able to do that. And sometimes people will come up to somebody who's going through a really difficult time of a life-changing kind of experience, and they want to know how you're doing, and they want to hear it, and you can't even articulate it. You know, I mean, here, like the example I just gave you, right? I was 10 months into it at that point, and all I could really tell you, still 10 months into it, was that one statement. And so families do need some privacy to try to get their hands and their heart around what these massive changes that are going on in their lives. And what I would encourage you in that privacy is not to rush people. If we're guilty of anything in the church as far as grief goes, it's rushing people through it. It's kind of like, oh, your mother died 6 weeks ago? You should be over that by now, right? I mean, we really do put timetables on people for grief. And the grief that's associated with disability often takes years to process. And now someone can get stuck in that. We'll talk about that in the acceptance part, but it does take, it takes a long time to really work your way through some of those things. So I'd encourage you not to rush someone. But the presence, you know, privacy is not a call to abandonment, right? Because what people need more than anything is to know that they will have folks who will walk alongside of them and be the hands and feet of Jesus in their life. And so there's a sensitive balance between giving people the privacy that they need and yet being a very real presence in their lives. I think one of the biggest fears that families have when they're dealing with the onset of disability is the fear that they know they can't do this alone and that they'll be left alone. That they can't do it alone, but they'll be left alone. And so, and one of the things that kind of reinforced that in my mind, I remember when my brother came to visit when Tim was just a baby, and he and his wife and their kids came up for the day. Tim was probably a week old, and I remember at the end of the day, we had a really good visit, and as they were driving away, I was standing upstairs in Freddie's room looking out the window, and I just had this heart-wrenching feeling. I remember calling out loud to my brother, who was outside. It was January, he couldn't hear me. You know, don't leave me. You know, this feeling, like this fear of being left alone to deal with something that was much bigger than you know you can do by yourself. And so be there, you know, for the life of a family in basic ways: visiting, cleaning, bringing meals, and listening, with a capital L-I-S-T-E-N, right? Listening. Think about how much better Job's friends did when they just listened, right? When they did a lot of talking, it didn't go well. So, and especially in these early stages, and without easy answers. These aren't things that have easy answers, you know, and it doesn't help to give easy answers to people. and normalcy. Even as a family is going through all this change, that to the degree that you can provide something that feels like normalcy to them, especially when they're children in the home, that's a real gift to the family. It's a kind of a place where you can center, for a little bit before you go re-enter the storm again. And here's a very basic way that somebody provided normalcy for us. Freddie's second birthday was when Tim was about 2 weeks old, and we were right between hospitalizations, right? We just come out of, I think, our second hospitalization. We were home for 24 hours before we went into the next one, and Tim had come home on oxygen and a monitor for that one 24-hour period, which happened to be Freddie's birthday. So you can imagine, as a mom, I did not exactly have time to pull off a party, right? A party or a cake or anything. And so my next door neighbor, who was a believer, just anticipated that. She just took care of it. So she and her family, and her daughter was one of Freddie's best little friends. They came over, they brought presents, they brought a cake, and I can't tell you how much that meant to me. For them to anticipate the need for that and to act on it. It's such a basic thing, and yet it brought our family this moment of normalcy in the midst of this storm that was just really precious. So, one of the best ways you can bring normalcy is to try to anticipate those things, but to also just ask what a family needs. And if they don't know, and a lot of times they won't know because they have so much to process, to help them just think it through. Give them some ideas. And but that's such a tremendous gift. And the last thing I want to point out is in this picture is a picture of Tim the day of his baptism, so with his grandparents, and that's part of normalcy, is rejoicing over the birth of a child born with a disability, right? And I can't tell you tragically how often that doesn't happen, right? Romans 12 talks about rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. And when a child with a disability is born, there's both. It's like that whole thing we talked about. The disability isn't celebratory, but the person always is. And so a child with a disability, his baptism is a wonderful, normal and exciting event to celebrate this unique life, right? And every life is a unique life, but this life that's endowed with a unique sense of purpose, right? Just like every other life is. And so don't forget to celebrate, even as you help the family work through their grief issues and all that, because it's rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn at the same time. So what a difference a day makes. Right? What a difference a day makes. And that the thing I would encourage you to remember is just to be there, right? Be there to understand what the family's going through. Be there to help them identify what their needs are, and be there as the body of Christ to respond, being the real hands and feet of Jesus in the life of that family.
The sudden entry of disability into the life of a family can feel like a September 11th experience. And its impact affects not only the biological family, but the church family as well. As a family unit engages all of the changes brought about through this new reality, it takes wisdom from God for the church family to strike a balance between providing privacy to process and presence. Please take a few moments to listen to the following interviews and consider the questions posed at the end of each segment.
For me, personally, I've always, I think, one sinful thing that I think I've struggled with in my own life is putting value on people or on things in more of a worldly way. I mean, basically, that looking at people and attaching value in connection with who somebody is, or what they may be able to do, or what kind of gifts they may have, or what they look like, or certain status things. And when you have a son that is not going to be able to do a lot of the things that you expected your children to do, it makes you really evaluate what it is that gives people value. And so for me, Joshua, the Lord has used Joshua to teach me about how God loves me, and Joshua cannot do certain things that other people can do, But he has an incredible capacity to love other people. He has an incredible capacity to do things that other people can't do. And it's made me realize, it's just shined a spotlight on my sin of how I will put value on people based on what they look like or what they can do.
How does loving a person with special needs cause us to examine our yardstick of human value?
When we go to visit a family, I must say I still always get butterflies in my stomach because every situation is so different. And I do pray that God will have whatever comes out of my mouth be the right words, or they will be on deaf ears, that they don't hear what I'm saying may be wrong. But I think the first things that we really try to do is not to tiptoe around what has happened in the family. So many people, other people can do that. You know, we understand that I want to hear your story, you know, and I want to be available to you, and I want to walk beside you with this, and we're willing to do that. So tell me, you know, what's going on in your lives. Some people are very open to that. Other people, you know, it takes a while, you know, and I think just being in their presence, you know, going out for coffee at first maybe, or just inviting them over to your house for a picnic, you know, those normal things can lead into trusting you maybe and helping to open up that these people really do care.
Why is it so important to listen to families as they tell their story?
Just folks being able to enter into the struggle with us. You know, we received lots of meals and things like that, and that was very nice. But people just being willing to enter into the struggle was what has helped us the most. Just listening, just letting us cry, letting us grieve. My wife talks about two ladies in particular that called her during some really dark times and just listened. And just by doing so, they really just sort of entered into the struggle. You know, we had lots of folks who would try to and make noble attempts to sort of be optimistic and really unintentionally give us they were trying to give us a false hope. I'm sure your son will be fine and this and that, and we knew he wasn't going to be. And so it really has taught us how to enter into the struggle with anyone who's suffering. We've learned how to do that through our son. And I would just characterize it that way. People just entering into the struggle, not having answers, not trying to give us a Bible verse necessarily, but just being there with us and sort of being the presence of Christ with us has been huge.
What does it mean to enter into the struggle? How does that communicate the presence of Christ?